A man vanishes into the fog, leaving behind only ash and suspicion. Welcome to the Whimsy Casebook. I am your host, Morgan Finch. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Hearing from you all makes this journey even more special. Let's begin. Varnet. Jules Varnet. Elderly, clean-shaven, with a stoop. Maigret had bought matches there once, months ago, and remembered how the man folded the coin change into a small wax-paper twist before handing it over, an old habit from wartime scarcity. The memory was thin, inconsequential, and yet it remained. He turned from the window and reached for his overcoat. Rain had a way of insisting, and Paris had a way of whispering when it wanted to be heard. "Going out, Chief?" asked Inspector Torrance, lifting his head briefly from a sheaf of reports. "Just stretching my legs," Maigret replied, already at the door. He didn't take a driver. The air, thick with moisture, clung to his collar, and his pipe remained unlit in his pocket. He walked with no particular urgency through the grey, lacework of wet streets and shuttered balconies, past cafes that steamed with midday soups, and the clatter of spoons on ceramic. Rue Montorgueil was awake in its own understated way. Delivery carts, grocers unstacking crates, a woman in a checkered apron wiping down a window, and yet something was off, or rather something was missing. The tobacco shop's shutters were still down, its front grate untouched. A paper notice, yellowing, not recent, fluttered behind the dusty glass. The display hadn't changed in months. Pipe cleaners, old cigarette tins, a curling price list for cigars, but no sign of Jules Varnet. Across the street, the florist was trimming stems from a wooden stool. Maigret crossed slowly and tipped his hat. "Monsieur Varnet, is he unwell?" he asked almost lazily, as though chatting about the weather. The florist, a wiry man in his 50s with a stiff moustache, gave a small shrug. "Didn't open this morning. Unusual, yes, but maybe he went to see his sister in Arpajon. He closes for her funerals and birthdays alike." Maigret smiled. "Many sisters," the florist chuckled dryly. "One. But you know how it is. The older he gets, the more reasons he needs to disappear for a day or two." Still, Maigret lingered. His eyes settled on the gap under the shop's door. No newspapers pushed through, no footprints in the thin mud gathered by the curb. The rain hadn't washed everything away, it never did. "Let me know if he's not back by tomorrow," Maigret said casually, already stepping back into the street. "Tell him an old customer was asking." The florist nodded, amused. Maigret returned to the office without hurry. He paused, outside a bakery along the way, and purchased a small loaf of pain de campagne, warm, with a hard crust that promised comfort. The vendor, a woman with cracked hands, recognized him but didn't speak. It was not yet noon when he sat down again behind his desk. The office was as it had been, damp wool, tired files, and the faintest echo of typewriters 2 rooms away. He placed the loaf in a drawer and lit his pipe for the first time that day. Later, perhaps in an hour, perhaps tomorrow, someone would ask after Jules Varnet, or they wouldn't. And that was what unsettled Maigret most. Not the absence, the silence. It was not the case itself that drew Maigret out again that afternoon. For strictly speaking, there was no case yet. No report had come in, no official complaint lodged. No one had gone missing in the eyes of the state, and certainly not someone as ordinary as Jules Varnet, a tobacconist in a quiet, rain-streaked quarter of Paris. And yet, by 3 o'clock, Maigret found himself again on Rue Montorgueil, his coat damp from the persistent drizzle that seemed to soften the edges of the city, making everything muted and a little older. The florist from earlier was gone, his stall covered with a waterproof tarp. Children darted between shop fronts with their collars turned up, and the bell above the bakery door rang each time a delivery boy entered with his basket. but the tobacconist's shop remained closed. No one had opened the shutters. The grate was still drawn halfway down like a forgotten gesture. More curious, perhaps, was the stillness around it. Not a single passer-by paused to comment or peer inside. A familiar place had become invisible by absence. Maigret stood across the street once more, lighting his pipe, though the match nearly blew out in the wind. He didn't stare. He looked. Past it, around it, as though his gaze might collect whatever the shop itself was unwilling to yield. It wasn't much, no broken lock, no forced entry. But still that faint discomfort lingered, the kind Maigret trusted more than logic. A wrong note in an otherwise routine melody. A woman in a navy raincoat approached with a shopping bag looped over her arm. She was middle-aged, perhaps 60, with dyed auburn hair and practical heels that clicked softly on the wet pavement. Maigret recognized her from earlier cases, not involved, just familiar from the courtier. He stepped lightly into her path. "Madame Delcourt, isn't it?" She paused, surprised but not alarmed. "Inspector Maigret," she said with a thin smile. "You remember everyone, don't you?" "I try. You live nearby?" "Just around the corner. Rue Marie Stuart." He nodded. "Did you happen to see Monsieur Varnet this morning?" "The tobacconist?" She glanced toward the shuttered shop. "Now that you mention it, no. Odd. He's always sweeping the front step by 8. Has he ever left without saying anything?" "Not to me, but I wouldn't say we were close. He was quiet, kept to himself." "Did he have any family?" "I heard he had a niece in Lyon. They say she wrote him letters, but no one ever saw her." Maigret thanked her and watched her vanish into the warmth of the bakery. Another match, another puff of his pipe. He moved now slowly, deliberately, and stepped across the street to the shop itself. The glass panel was fogged slightly on the inside, though the rest of the window showed signs of dust and neglect. No cleaning cloth had touched it in several days. He leaned forward, pressing one large hand flat against the wooden door. It didn't yield, locked. He jiggled the handle gently, then crouched down, knees creaking slightly, to inspect the space beneath. Dry, perfectly dry. Not even a film of moisture seeping through, which was curious given the weather. He straightened and looked up at the flats above. The building was 3 stories high, typical for the street. Living quarters above, business below. Curtains were drawn in most windows. A single shutter clapped softly in the wind. He made his way around the side alley, boots echoing on the cobblestones. There, behind the building, was a narrow courtyard hemmed in by tall stone walls. A drain gurgled somewhere beneath the surface. Garbage bins lined one side, and a bicycle leaned against a stairwell. He climbed the back stair. It was a common structure, a servant's access that led up to the living quarters. He knocked once on the 2nd floor. No answer. Then again, more firmly. A rustle behind the door, a shuffle. Finally it opened a crack. The woman inside was in her 70s with white hair drawn into a tight bun and eyes like grey stones. Suspicious. Wary. "Yes?" "Chief Inspector Maigret," he said, holding up his identification. "I'm inquiring about Monsieur Varnet, the tobacconist. Do you live in the same building?" "I do," she said, still not opening the door fully. "But I don't make it my business to pry." "I'm not asking you to," Maigret replied with mild warmth. "Have you seen him today?" "No." A pause. "Not yesterday either, now that I think of it." "Did you hear anything strange during the night? Movement, a visitor?" She hesitated. "There was a noise. Not last night. The night before. Like something heavy fell. But I didn't go down." "What time?" "Late. After midnight." "I sleep light." Maigret nodded, then added softly, "Did he often have visitors?" She sniffed. "Not that I noticed. Always alone, except for deliveries. He lived above the shop. Small flat. Kept to himself." Maigret offered a brief thank you and descended the stairs. The rain had become a mist again, fine as gauze. He returned to the front of the shop and lingered. It would be simpler to wait. But the silence troubled him, and if something had happened, something subtle, not criminal yet troubling, then waiting might only prolong the harm. He turned and walked 2 streets over to the local locksmith. It was a tiny place, wedged between a tailor and a brasserie, and smelled of metal shavings and damp leather. The owner, a round-faced man with thick fingers and a cautious smile, had known Maigret for years. "I need access," Maigret said. "Rue Montorgueil, number 118. Can you come?" The man hesitated. "There's no report, no complaint." "Just a concern," Maigret said. "If I'm wrong, I'll owe you a cigar." They walked back together, saying little. When they reached the shop, the locksmith crouched with a small leather pouch, his tools clicking quietly as he worked. The lock resisted slightly, old stiff, but then turned with a dull metallic sigh. Maigret stepped inside. The air was close. Not foul, but lived in. The kind of atmosphere built by decades of tobacco, varnish, and human routine. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with yellowed boxes and tins, postcards curled from age, and a faint smell of dried mint leaves in a ceramic bowl. The counter was undisturbed. No signs of struggle, no scattered papers. But one thing caught Maigret's eye immediately. Behind the counter on a small wooden hook hung the shop keys, but the apartment key, he remembered its shape, was missing. He turned toward the back and climbed the narrow stairs. The flat above was small, 2 rooms and a kitchenette. A lamp burned low in the corner, casting a faint golden light over the tidy interior. Nothing was broken. Nothing was overturned. But the teacup on the table had a dried ring of brown at its base, and the small radio on the shelf, usually off, was still humming low static. In the bedroom the bed had been made, too neatly, the blanket stretched tight, the pillow unused. Maigret stood in the center of the room, listening. There was no sound, now but the ticking of a wall clock, and suddenly he knew something was wrong, not from what he saw, but from what was absent. Jules Varnet had left in the middle of his routine, left a light on, left a radio murmuring, left a cup unfinished, but he hadn't come back, and no one had noticed. Maigret lit his pipe again, though the match trembled slightly in his fingers. Then he sat, slowly, in the chair by the small table and waited. Not for someone to enter, but for the truth, which always arrived eventually through silence. The apartment above the tobacco shop gave the impression of having paused rather than been abandoned. It was not the chaos of a sudden departure that struck Maigret, but the careful stillness, a teacup resting on its saucer, as though the drinker had only stepped away for a moment, slippers tucked neatly beneath the armchair, an ashtray containing her single stubbed-out cigarette smoked only halfway. Jules Varnet, from what little Maigret remembered of him, had been a creature of small habits. He had kept regular hours, exchanged nods with neighbors but never long conversations, wore the same brown overcoat each season, and once declined a price reduction on a tin of tobacco with a polite but firm wave of the hand. Men like Varnet lived in quiet patterns, and when those patterns broke, even slightly, it left a peculiar unease, like a crooked painting on an otherwise perfect wall. Maigret stood by the small dining table, examining the objects left behind not as clues, but as expressions of personality. A white linen napkin was folded beside the teacup. The napkin had been used, faintly stained with what looked like apricot jam, the same kind Madame Maigret had served him that very morning. On the far wall, a small calendar hung from a nail, its pages turned dutifully. The date was circled, in red pencil, Monday the 6th. That was yesterday. No notes accompanied the mark, no appointments scribbled beside it. Just a single red ring, like the mark left by a wineglass on paper. He stepped into the narrow hallway that connected the kitchen to the bedroom. The air smelled of wood polish and the dry musk of old papers. Their mirror, slightly tarnished, hung above a coat hook, where a second overcoat, darker than the one he remembered Varnet wearing, hung limp and heavy, as if it hadn't been moved in weeks. Beneath it sat a pair of shoes, polished but unused. In the bedroom the sense of stillness was even stronger. The bed was made tightly, corners folded military style. A rosary hung from the bedpost. On the nightstand rested a small brass clock, ticking softly. Beside it were 3 letters, unopened, and a photograph in a metal frame. A studio portrait from the 1940s, faded at the edges. A young woman, unsmiling, with dark eyes and tightly wound curls. She wore a brooch at her collar. A niece, perhaps. Or a sister long gone. Maigret picked up the letters. The top envelope bore a Lyon postmark dated a week ago. The handwriting was round and somewhat old-fashioned. It was addressed simply, Monsieur Jules Varnet, 118, Rue Montorgueil, Paris. He turned the envelope over but did not open it. The second was a utility bill, still sealed. The third, more curious, had no return address and had been opened, though carefully. Inside was a folded sheet of pale blue paper. He removed it and read slowly. Jules. I shouldn't write. Know that, but I couldn't ignore what I saw. If you won't go to the police, at least speak to her again. I've done what I can. M. That was all. No date, no context. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, someone accustomed to choosing their words carefully. The note was unsigned but carried a peculiar tone of urgency, quiet but pressing, as though the writer had struggled against their own caution. He folded it again and replaced it gently where he found it. In the corner of the room stood a low bookshelf filled mostly with dog-eared detective novels and several histories of the First World War. On top of the shelf rested an old leather-bound address book. He opened it. Names, most of them crossed out. A few addresses still legible, tobacconist supply vendors, 1 or 2 old army contacts, and under N the name Nicole Varnet, 3 Rue des Chartreux, Lyon. It was something, not proof, but connection. He took down the telephone receiver and dialed the exchange for Lyon, waiting through the long clicks and pulses as the line connected. The operator took some time. Finally, a tired voice answered. Yes? Pardon, is this Mademoiselle Nicole Varnet? A pause, then cautious. Who is asking? This is Chief Inspector Maigret of the Police Judiciaire in Paris. Another pause, longer this time. Has something happened to Uncle Jules? Maigret softened his tone. I'm not sure. He didn't open his shop this morning, nor yesterday. No one's heard from him. I'm calling to ask whether you've spoken to him recently. There was a rustle on the other end, perhaps of a chair being pulled closer or papers being moved. I sent him a letter last week, she said. It wasn't urgent, just news. Have you visited him recently? Not in years. We wrote occasionally. He wasn't very encouraging of visits. I see. Did you know anyone by the initial M? Someone who might have written to him? She hesitated again. No, unless... She stopped herself. Yes. There was a woman, years ago. I don't know her name, but I think he once called her Mado. It might have been short for Meline. She was younger than him. I think. He never spoke of her directly, only once after a glass of wine. Do you know where she lived? No. He said only that it was a mistake he'd carried too long, that he regretted not handling it better. I never pressed. "Thank you, Mademoiselle Varney," Maigret said. "If you think of anything else, please call the Quai des Orfèvres." She gave a faint promise to do so, and the line went dead with a soft click. Maigret stood again, pipe between his fingers, unlit. He turned to the photograph once more. Was that Mado? Or someone else? There was a sadness in the woman's eyes that did not match the stern studio pose. He returned to the kitchen. On the small table near the cup sat a pad of notepaper and a pencil stub. The top page had been torn off. Beneath it a faint impression, barely visible. He angled the lamp, tilting the paper under the light. The grooves revealed a single word, traced by the pressure of the missing sheet. Portillon. He mouthed the word. A name. A street. A village. It didn't matter yet. But it would. He sat for another 10 minutes without moving. The rain outside grew heavier, tapping more urgently against the window pane. A car passed on the wet street below, its tires slicing through shallow puddles. Nothing violent had happened here. No broken glass, no bloodstains. But violence didn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it moved softly, beneath gestures and glances. And Maigret had learned over the years to listen to what the silence implied. He rose at last, closing the drawer carefully, folding the letter from Lyon and the unsigned note into a small envelope for the file. He would speak to Janvier in the morning, perhaps assign someone to look into the name Portillon. But for now, he took one last look at the small, still flat and closed the door behind him. Below in the tobacco shop, everything remained untouched, unbothered, waiting. The next morning broke without ceremony. A low sky pressed over Paris like a damp, woolen blanket, and the Seine moved in sluggish coils between its stone embankments. Pigeons huddled beneath awnings, and the street cleaners moved through puddles with the slow resignation of men who knew they'd be clearing the same wet leaves again tomorrow. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the air inside the stone corridors was close and quiet. The radiators clanked irregularly, and someone coughed behind a closed office door. Maigret arrived without haste, having walked from home with his collar turned up and his thoughts somewhere between the words Portillon and Mado. He hung his coat on the usual peg, brushed the rain from his hat, and sat at his desk, with a low grunt. His pipe was already between his fingers, though he didn't light it. Instead, he looked over the envelope containing the 2 notes from Varnet's apartment. He had not slept badly, but his dreams had been filled with half-faces, grey stairwells, and the sound of someone walking just ahead, always around a corner. Janvier entered quietly, holding a folder and a cup of coffee, which he set down on the desk without a word. "You're early," Maigret said. "My son had a fever," Janvier replied, shrugging off his overcoat. "No point staying in a house that's already awake." Maigret gave a faint grunt of sympathy and tapped the folder. "Nothing urgent. I need a discreet look into a name, Portillon." Janvier raised an eyebrow. "Person, place?" "Possibly both, or neither. I found the word impressed into a notepad belonging to a man named Jules Varnet, a tobacconist on Rue Montorgueil. He hasn't been seen since Monday." "Gone missing?" "Not officially, but something doesn't sit right. No signs of violence, no distress, but the kind of absence that feels off." Janvier opened a notepad. "And Portillon?" "Check electoral registers, civil records, whatever you can find. If it's, say, a street, it'll be in the directory. If it's a person, they may have left a trace." Janvier nodded and rose without further comment. That was the rhythm of the office. A name, a word, sometimes a half-memory, and from it, something or nothing. Maigret, left alone again, took a long sip of the lukewarm coffee and leaned back in his chair. The office was not yet busy. Only the sound of a typewriter 2 rooms down punctuated the quiet. A fine moment to think. He reflected again on the letter from Lyon, polite, familial, harmless, and the other note, unsigned, terse, and oddly urgent. "I couldn't ignore what I saw," it had said. What had been seen, and who was the her it referred to? The name Maddo lingered in his mind. A name with perfume, he thought. Not an official name, not the one on documents. The name, a man. Might use in conversation when speaking of someone whose presence still disturbed him. By mid-morning, Janvier returned, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, a small ink stain on his shirt cuff. "Portillon," he said, sitting. "I checked it 3 ways. Maigret leaned forward slightly. "There's no one by that surname in the Paris census records, not recently, but there's a Madame Portillon listed in the administrative rolls. For a small town in the Loiret, Saint-Aubin-des-Bois, widow, late 70s. Lives alone according to the register. No phone listed. Too far for a tobacconist to keep correspondence," Maigret murmured. Janvier continued. "But there's also a Rue Portillon in the 12th arrondissement. Small residential. Street just off Rue de Charenton. Only a few buildings, mostly apartments and a bakery." That, Maigret thought, had a better ring to it. "I'll go take a look," he said, standing. "Don't log anything yet." He left the building with the sense of following a thread not fully visible, a habit built over years, where intuition filled the gaps until facts could catch up. The taxi took him across the Seine, through the muddled traffic of Place des Îles, à la Bastille, and into the quieter rhythms of the 12th arrondissement. The buildings grew more modest, the architecture less ornate. Life here was lived without spectacle. Housewives returned from the markets, children ran past postmen, and the cafes served simple lunches of stew and bread. Rue Portillon was short and plain. A narrow corridor of stone facades, iron balconies, and the faint scent of baking from a shop halfway down. Maigret stepped out and stood at the curb, pipe still unlit, observing. There were 8 buildings, in all. He started with the bakery. Inside, the warmth was immediate, as was the smell of butter and yeast. Behind the counter stood a woman in her early 50s, flour still on her wrists. "Bonjour," Maigret said. "Bonjour, Inspector." So, he had been recognized. It happened more often now, not fame exactly, but familiarity. His face, heavy and thoughtful, had appeared enough in newspapers and corridors to linger in memory. "I'm making quiet inquiries," he said. "Do you know if a woman named Maddo ever lived on this street?" The woman frowned thoughtfully. "Maddo? Not recently, but there was one. Mademoiselle Madeleine Piquet. She lived on the 3rd floor of number 6. That would have been, 15 years ago now. Maybe more." "What happened to her?" "She moved, that's all. I don't recall where. She kept to herself mostly, but she used to work nights. Cabaret girl, I think. Had the look." Maigret gave a slight nod. "Was there ever a man? Anyone who visited often?" "A few," the woman said, eyes narrowing slightly with the effort of memory. "But one in particular. Older, respectable, always in a coat and tie. He'd bring her groceries sometimes. Quiet type. I think she called him Jules." Maigret's eyes didn't change, but he felt the confirmation settle quietly in his chest. "She ever caused trouble?" "No," the woman said, but there was something sad about her, like someone waiting for something that wouldn't come back. "Do you know where she went?" She shook her head. "She left suddenly. No warning. One day the flat was empty. Landlord never said why." Maigret thanked her, purchased a small brioche out of courtesy, and stepped back into the chill street. He walked slowly to number 6. It was an ordinary apartment building. Buzzers lined the doorway, a cracked tile near the stoop. He didn't ring. There was no need. Instead, he stood there for a long minute looking up at the third floor. Madeleine Piquet, Mado, a tobacconist who once brought her groceries, a vanished man, an unsigned note. Maigret lit his pipe at last, drawing the smoke deep. The pieces did not yet fit, but the edge of something had begun to show, and what interested him more than the absence of Jules Varnet was the silence of Madeleine Piquet. The sky over Paris had begun to clear by the time Maigret left Rue Portillon. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets rinsed clean but heavy with moisture, like a sponge that refused to dry. In the air hung the smell of damp stone, of morning, coal fires burning down to ash, and of something fainter, memory perhaps stirred up by old names. Back at Quai des Orfèvres, the office had filled with its usual low murmur. Phones ringing softly, typewriter keys punctuating silence like rain on tin. Janvier was at his desk again, reading through a slim folder. "She existed," Maigret said as he entered, shedding his coat and setting down the bakery brioche now cold. "Mado, real name Madeleine Piquet, lived on Rue Portillon over a decade ago. Quiet, used to work nights." Janvier looked up. "Still in Paris?" "Unknown, but she left suddenly. No forwarding address. The bakery woman remembers an older man who visited often. Groceries, quiet presence, always polite." Janvier let out a slow breath. "Varnet." Maigret didn't reply. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a slip of paper. "I'd like you to check cabaret license renewals from 12 to 15 years ago, not just in the 12th, broader. Focus on places where a Madeleine or Mado Piquet might have worked. We won't find a contract, but there may be mention of her in employment records, old permits." Janvier took the note and nodded. "What kind of cabaret, large or small?" "She had the look of someone used to small stages," Maigret said quietly. "A few lights, a red curtain, the kind of place where women sang between whiskey orders." He remained at his desk, filling his pipe but not lighting it, watching. The smoke of others drift across the room like thoughts made visible. By early afternoon, Janvier returned with a single folded sheet. "There's a possible match. Club Paloma. It operated in the 9th arrondissement for nearly 20 years. Closed 8 years ago. Owner was Marcel Grenet. I called. He still lives nearby." Maigret rose without speaking. A name, a place, and more importantly, someone who might still remember her. The taxi ride to the Rue Blanche was short and uneventful. The Club Paloma, long shuttered, sat behind dusty windows now occupied by a dry cleaner. The red letters had been painted over, but the faint outline of Paloma was still visible when the light hit at an angle. Grenet's address was just a block away, a third-floor flat in a building that smelled of boiled potatoes and furniture, wax. The concierge didn't ask questions. Maigret climbed the stairs with his usual slow determination, pausing only once before knocking. The man who answered was short, stout, and wore a cardigan with a hole in the sleeve. His hair was thin but carefully combed, and his face bore the distracted softness of someone who had survived without fully understanding how. "Yes? Marcel Grenet?" "That's me." Maigret showed his card. "I'm looking for information about a woman who may have worked at your club. Madeleine Piquet, possibly known as Mado." Grenet blinked slowly, then opened the door wider. "I wasn't expecting to hear that name again. May I come in?" Grenet nodded and gestured toward a worn armchair. The room was warm, filled with the faint hum of an electric heater and the sharp smell of old linoleum. A canary chirped from a cage near the window. "She sang with us," Grenet said, sitting opposite Maigret and rubbing his palms together, as though trying to warm old bones. Not a star, but she had presence, a certain sadness, you know? That appealed to the crowd. Men would lean forward when she walked on stage. How long did she work there? Maybe 4 years, on and off. She came to us after something else ended, never said what. She wasn't young, not for the business, but there was something elegant about her. She wore gloves even in the dressing room. Do you know what became of her? Grenet shook his head. She left one night. No warning, just didn't show up. That was 8 years ago, maybe more. Was she ever involved with anyone? He frowned. There were admirers. Men who brought flowers left letters, but she kept a distance except for one. Older man? Yes. Polite, dignified, didn't speak much, sat in the back. She never smiled at him, but once I caught her crying after he'd left. Did he ever cause trouble? No, he wasn't the type. She called him Monsieur Jules once when she thought I wasn't listening. Maigret exhaled slowly. Did she have family? None that I knew of. She was discreet, a woman with regrets, the sort who looked at her reflection too long. And the man, Jules? Did he stop coming after she left? Grenet nodded. He came twice more, sat in the same chair, ordered nothing, just sat. Then he disappeared too. Maigret stood. If anything else comes back to you? Grenet gave a tight smile. Memories don't work like that, Inspector. They return when they choose. He saw himself out, descending the stairs more, slowly this time. Outside, the wind had picked up. A curtain of early evening light hung over the boulevard, casting long shadows against the facades. Jules Varnet and Madeleine Piquet, a tobacconist and a singer, a quiet man bringing groceries, a woman in gloves who left no trace, and now both had vanished, not with violence, but into the soft folds of Paris itself. Maigret stopped by a small café, took a seat by the window, and ordered a beer. As he watched people pass, couples, bickering, a dog tugging at its leash, an old man smoking by the metro steps, he thought of how people disappear long before they go missing. Sometimes, Maigret believed, the heart made the decision before the body followed. A man would close a shop door, turn a key, and simply not open it again. He lit his pipe at last. There was no urgency, but there was something hollow in the silence they'd left behind. Evening arrived with a hush. Paris, momentarily spared the usual din of engines and barking dogs, seemed to fall into a gentler rhythm. Street lamps blinked awake, pools of yellow, light gathering on wet cobblestones, while shutters were drawn with a quiet clatter above darkened storefronts. Maigret did not return home immediately. He sat for nearly an hour in the café, drinking his beer slowly, watching the world like a man listening for something beneath the surface, a crack in the stillness, a misplaced word. But the city gave him nothing more than motion, indifference, and the comforting clink of glasses behind the counter. Back at Quai des Orfèvres, he entered without speaking, and the night clerk gave a small nod as if to confirm the silence. Maigret paused at his desk and lit his pipe again, letting the tobacco smoke curl toward the low ceiling. He pulled out the notes taken earlier that day and reread the name, Madeleine Piquet. Mado, a woman who had left no clear trace, only faint echoes through other people's memories. He opened Varnet's address book again, flipping through the brittle pages not for names now but for scribbles, annotations, signs of indecision. On one torn edge, scrawled faintly in pencil and nearly illegible, was a partial note. Lay, Tauteuil 46, Madame L. Maigret squinted. The handwriting had been hurried, possibly erased at some point and rewritten, but the meaning wasn't entirely obscure. Auteuil, the neighborhood, or the street, and Madame L, a woman. Perhaps someone Varney or Mado had known, or a contact quietly maintained for years. The following morning, under a flat white sky, Maigret walked alone through the quiet residential lanes of Auteuil. The houses here were modest but dignified, older structures with iron gates, high hedges, and garden paths lined with early roses just beginning to bloom. Even the silence here felt more practiced, as though the buildings had grown used to being discreet. Number 46 turned out to be a weathered townhouse divided into apartments. The mailbox bore a single name in smudged black ink, Lemoine. He rang. The bell. No answer at first. Then, after a long pause, footsteps. The door opened slowly to reveal a woman of indeterminate age, wrapped in a thick dressing gown, her hair held back by pins. She blinked at him with sleepy suspicion. Madame Lemoine. Yes? He presented his card. Chief Inspector Maigret. I'm looking for information on a woman who may have lived here. Madeleine Piquet. Possibly visited you some years ago. A slow cloud passed through her eyes. Then she stepped aside. Come in. The hallway's cold. The sitting room was sparsely furnished but clean, with an embroidered cushion on each chair and a porcelain teapot resting on a tray. A radio played faint classical music from a corner shelf. Maigret sat without removing his coat. The woman watched him carefully, then poured tea into a chipped cup and placed it before him. I remember her, she said. It's been years, but I don't forget faces. Did she live here? No, but she came often, especially after she left her job. Quiet visits, she never stayed long, sometimes just sat. I think she needed a place to be unseen. Was she family? Not mine, but she was close to my sister. Hélène, may she rest in peace. They'd worked together in one of those clubs, long ago. When Hélène fell ill, Mado helped her. Brought her broth, washed her hair. Maigret nodded slowly. She talked very little, Madame Lemoine continued, but you could see it in her eyes. Regret, exhaustion. There was something that never left her. Not bitterness, more like waiting for something to be made right. Did she ever speak of a man? Older, perhaps? A Monsieur Jules? Yes, the woman said without hesitation. She never used his full name, but she kept a photograph in her purse, a small one. She once let me see it, said he had been kind to her. Too kind, perhaps. That she hadn't deserved it. She said that? Yes. I asked if they'd been together. She shook her head, said she'd ruined something, or nearly had, and had spent years trying not to ask for forgiveness. Do you know where she went after? She stayed with a charity group for a while. I think she cleaned rooms at a residence for retired women in the 14th arrondissement. After that? I don't know. Maigret finished his tea, grateful for the warmth it left in his chest. He stood and offered his hand. Thank you, madame. You've been generous. She shook his hand with surprising firmness. I don't know if she's alive, Inspector, but if you find her, tell her she didn't owe anyone anything. Back outside, the wind had picked up again. Maigret walked with his hands deep in his coat pockets, the street narrowing behind him. A woman, with guilt in her voice. A tobacconist with groceries in his arms. A photograph hidden in a purse. By the time he returned to Quai des Orfèvres, the sky was the color of tin, and the river had turned a pale green. He stopped only to warm his hands at the radiator before instructing Janvier. There's a residence in the 14th, for retired women. Try the Saint-Ambroise registry first. Madeleine Piquet may have worked there. Janvier didn't ask questions. They both knew the rhythm by now. Maigret sat again. He lit his pipe. He felt more than ever that he was moving toward something. Not a crime, not even a disappearance in the traditional sense, but a quiet wound that had never closed. A man leaves his tobacco shop. A woman vanishes behind her regrets. And, somewhere between them, something had been left unsaid for too long. It was just past 9 in the morning when Maigret stepped off the tram in the 14th arrondissement, the sky hanging low with a muted grey that felt more like damp cloth than air. The neighbourhood, practical and unglamorous, moved to a quieter rhythm than the bustling heart of the city. Here bakeries did not decorate their bread, they wrapped it plainly. Children hurried to school with scarves pulled up to their ears, and the old men on corners smoked slowly, saying little. Maigret walked with a measured pace, glancing now and then at the brass street numbers beside narrow doorways. The retirement. Her residence he was looking for, Saint-Ambroise, occupied a modest stone building set back from the street, its facade worn and sunless, the paint flaking slightly around the window frames. There was no sign, just a small wooden plaque near the entrance that read, Maison Saint-Ambroise, Résidence pour dames âgées. He pressed the buzzer, waited, and was greeted by a soft buzz and the click of the latch. Inside, the hallway was narrow and smelled of boiled cabbage, lavender soap and old wool. The walls were decorated with faded prints of flowers and rural landscapes, not to comfort, Maigret thought, but to distract. A thin woman in her 60s, wearing a navy cardigan and carrying a clipboard, emerged from a side office. "Bonjour," she said. "You're expected." "No," Maigret replied, producing his identification. "I'm making quiet inquiries." Her eyebrows rose slightly, not with alarm, but recognition. The kind of recognition reserved for someone who'd seen men like him before. "Inspector Maigret," he said. "I'm looking for a woman who may have worked here some years ago. Madeleine Piquet, possibly known as Mado. Not as a resident, but as a cleaner or helper." She frowned, lowering the clipboard. "Not a name I've heard in some time. You said Piquet?" "Yes." "Well," she said, motioning for him to follow. "Come through. The offices are this way." He followed her past a day room where 3 elderly women played cards under the watchful eye of a nurse, then down a corridor lined with closed doors, each bearing a brass number, and a crocheted doily. The silence here was heavier. Not oppressive, but well-worn. It was a silence of slippers on floors, of radios turned low, of women waiting out the last years of their lives with quiet dignity. In a small administrative room, she gestured to a filing cabinet and began to search. "We don't keep staff records forever," she said, "especially for temporary help. But we do have old schedules, volunteer rosters. Here." She pulled a thin folder from the back of a drawer and flipped through it. "Here's a reference. Madeleine Piquet. Employed as night cleaner. 3 months in 1956, another stint in 1958. Then again for a brief period in 61, never full-time, paid weekly. No address listed, only a phone number, which I doubt still exists." Maigret leaned forward. "Do you remember her personally?" The woman looked up. "Only vaguely. I was young then. She worked odd hours, evenings mostly. Quiet. Some of the residents liked her. Said she sang under her breath when she thought no one was listening. Old cabaret songs." "Was she close to anyone?" The woman thought for a moment. "There was one resident, Madame Crépin. She's long since passed. But they would sit together sometimes in the evenings. Mado would bring her tea. I remember being surprised. Cleaners didn't usually linger." "Was there ever trouble?" "Not trouble, no. But one evening the head nurse found her, crying in the laundry room. Said she'd received a letter. When asked, she claimed it was nothing, but she handed in her notice the next day. Just walked away from the job. Didn't even collect her last pay." "What year was that?" "Late. 61 October, I believe. Maigret nodded slowly. Would anyone still be here who might remember her better? She hesitated. Perhaps Madame Besson. She's one of our oldest residents. Been here nearly 30 years, 3rd floor. Room 312. She's lucid most days. He thanked her and took the stairs slowly, one hand grazing the wooden banister worn, smooth from years of use. On the 3rd floor he knocked gently at 312 and waited. A soft voice called out, "Yes?" He entered. The room was warm, filled with the scent of orange peels and old talcum powder. A small woman, her hair perfectly white and pulled back into a loose bun, sat in a high-backed chair by the window. Her lap was covered by a knitted shawl, and a book lay open beside her on a table. "Madame Besson?" Maigret asked gently. She turned her head with effort, peering at him. "Yes, and you are?" "Inspector Maigret, I'm looking for someone you might have known. A woman named Madeleine Piquet." Something flickered in her face. Not surprise, but recognition painted in very faint strokes. "Mado," she said almost to herself. "Yes, I knew her." "May I sit?" She nodded. He took the seat across from her. The room was quiet, save for the ticking of a ceramic clock on the mantel. "She used to sing," Madame Besson said, "when she thought no one could hear. Poor thing, always trying not to be noticed." "Did she ever speak of her past?" "She spoke little, but you could tell she had lived. Not the kind of woman who marries young and grows old gently. There was sadness in her bones." "Did she ever speak of a man, someone named Jules?" At that, Madame Besson leaned back and looked out the window for a long moment. "She never said his name. But once, when the post arrived, she clutched the letter like a child, didn't open it, just held it. I asked if it was from family. She said no, said it was from someone who should have forgotten her. She left soon after that. She did, but not angry, not ashamed even, just quiet, like someone who had finally said goodbye." Maigret let the silence settle between them, not out of strategy, but respect. The old woman closed her eyes for a moment, breathing softly. "She wasn't bad," she whispered, "just tired. Some women are tired their whole lives." He rose, thanked her, and left quietly. Back on the ground floor, the world felt noisier. The shuffle of nurses' shoes, the murmur of a radio, the clatter of a tray being pushed down a corridor. Outside, the sky had lightened slightly, but the wind still bit at the edges. Madeleine Piquet had passed through lives the way fog passed through alleyways, noticed only in retrospect, never lingering. And if she had received a letter from Jules, the Jules who now no longer opened his shop, then that letter might have been the last bridge between them. A bridge too fragile to cross again. Maigret returned to his office without speaking to anyone. He poured himself a glass of water, sat behind his desk, and took out the small blue note once more. "If you won't go to the police, at least speak to her again." But what if he had tried? What if Jules Varnet had spoken, and the silence afterward had proven too deep to fill? It was the kind of afternoon that slipped through the cracks unnoticed, neither cold nor warm, bright nor dark. Paris carried on in its usual rhythm, and Chief Inspector Maigret, pipe unlit and coat buttoned against the lingering chill, returned, once more to Rue Montorgueil. It had become a familiar walk over the past few days, and yet, each time, it revealed itself in slight alterations. A fresh chalkboard menu outside the cafe, a new tear in the awning above the fruit stall, a different pair of shoes on the concierge's step. The tobacconist's shop at number 118 still sat in quiet suspension, shutters drawn, the windows unchanged. It was neither abandoned nor alive, merely waiting. The grate still hung halfway down, as though Jules Varnet had meant to return at any moment, only to forget what he was stepping out for. Maigret unlocked the shop door with the same key the locksmith had copied, hesitating briefly before pushing it open. The bell above the door gave a muted jingle, though no one was there to hear it but him. The air inside was stale but undisturbed. Dust had begun to settle on the counter, but not enough to suggest complete neglect. He stepped inside and shut the door behind him. The shop was modest in size, no more than a dozen steps from end to end, lined with orderly shelves of pipes, tobacco tins, and cartons of cigarettes. Postcards in a revolving stand bore outdated photographs of the Arc de Triomphe, the Eiffel Tower, the Sacré-Cœur in summer sun. A calendar still showed the date Varney had disappeared, Monday the 6th, a red circle around the square, drawn with slow intention. Maigret moved behind the counter and examined the register. It had not been closed out, nor had it been tampered with. A handful of coins lay in the change tray, neatly stacked. The floor mat had the imprint of shoes, not fresh, but not entirely faded either. He crouched down and opened the cabinets. Beneath the counter, more out of patience than hope, inside were rows of meticulously organized boxes, spare lighters, cleaning cloths, tins of tobacco arranged by brand and origin. But in one drawer, smaller than the rest and tucked toward the back, he found something odd. Not shocking, not revealing, but out of step with the rest. It was filled with matchbooks. Not the kind handed out in bars or restaurants. These were collected. Each had been used or partly used and tucked away. Some were folded flat, others still bulged with unused matches. They came from various places: cafes, hotels, rail stations. Some bore foreign lettering, Italian, Spanish. One had the faded logo of a bar in Lyon. Another was from the Club Paloma. He took them out one by one, laying them across the counter in a quiet row. 53 matchbooks in all. A modest obsession, perhaps, or a private ritual. Among them, tucked between two more brightly colored ones, was a plain matchbook in a paper sleeve. It bore no logo, just the handwritten words, M. Rue Portillon, troisième étage. Maigret held it for a moment, running his thumb along the edge, not a clue in the criminal sense, but a thread in the tapestry of a life. He turned to the small alcove that led to the stairs. Upstairs the apartment awaited as it had before, the bed still made, the lamp still casting its golden hue, the cup still dry at its base. This time Maigret moved differently. He was not looking for something new. He was listening to what had already been left behind. He opened the wardrobe and looked through the garments, all neatly pressed, all in similar tones. Varnet's clothing was like the man himself, understated, orderly, deeply settled into routine. In the inside pocket of a blazer, he found a folded slip of paper. The ink faded to brown. He opened it carefully. It was a receipt from a photo. Shop, dated 3 months prior. No name, just a note in the corner. Duplicate prints. Curious, Maigret thought. He replaced the slip and moved to the writing desk. He had searched it before, leafed through the address book, glanced at the unopened letters. But now, with new eyes, he noticed a second drawer beneath the writing. Surface? It was locked. He retrieved the ring of keys found behind the counter, trying each slowly, until one turned with a faint click. Inside was a small collection of envelopes bound with string, photographs, mostly of places, bridges, rivers, a church courtyard in winter, but in the middle, 2 photographs of a woman, both in black and white. Meline. One showed her in profile, perhaps taken at a distance, unaware. The other was older, a studio portrait. It matched the one by Varnet's bed, though here she smiled, faintly, uncertainly. Also inside the drawer was a notebook, worn and used sparingly. Not a journal, not filled with thoughts or confessions. Just entries, dates, places, single lines. March 12th, she walked past the post office, did not look up. April 4th, sat on the bench near the cinema. Rain. She had no umbrella. May 9th, she smiled at the shopkeeper. First time in weeks. Maigret closed the notebook gently, his hands suddenly very still. These were not the writings of a stalker. There was no malice in them, no obsession, only observation, memory. A man watching someone from a distance he had decided never to close. Downstairs again, Maigret sat in the same chair behind the counter and let his weight settle. He understood now. Jules Varnet had not vanished into danger. He had not fled. Guilt or shame or even a crime. He had disappeared into himself. Into the years of quiet waiting and remembering and preserving the fragments of something he had once been near, but never quite held. A tobacconist's life left little in the way of drama. But between the matchbooks and the photos, the clipped notes and the empty cup, Maigret could trace a silent life shaped by absence. The shop was tidy because Varnet had known exactly where everything was supposed to be. The drawer was locked because it held the things he dared not name. And the each artist calendar had one day marked in red because perhaps, just perhaps, and he had meant to see her again. And failed. Maigret lit his pipe at last, letting the smoke rise slowly in the stale air. There was no urgency in what remained, only a quiet obligation to see it through. The following morning, a low fog clung to the city like a secret. Soft, around the ankles, slow to rise, turning the familiar outlines of buildings into hesitant sketches. Maigret left his home quietly, stepping out into the mist with a sense of thoughtfulness that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with unfinished presence. He walked to the Quai des Orfèvres as he often did, pipe unlit, coat collar turned up against the morning damp. The streets were already waking, delivery carts rattling across stones, cafe owners unlocking their doors, and a single schoolboy running to catch a tram, his bag bouncing against his hip like an afterthought. At his desk, Janvier waited, with a fresh pot of coffee and a look that hovered between inquiry and patience. Maigret took the cup silently, nodded his thanks, and pulled a slip of paper from his coat pocket. "Find this shop," he said, sliding it across the desk. "A photo developer. There's no address, only a business stamp from the receipt. Just a name. Photo Éclair." Janvier studied it. "Any idea of the arrondissement?" "None. But it was the last place Varnet seems to have gone. 3 months ago, had duplicate prints made." "Of her?" "Presumably." Janvier was already rising. "I'll check the business registry, then I'll call around." Discreetly, Maigret added. He spent the next hour reviewing his own notes, the matchbook drawer, the faint writing in the notepad, the photograph in the purse remembered by Madame Lemoine, the notebook of silent entries, like a man writing shadows across the pages of days. Maigret did not think Varnet had harmed anyone, at least not recently, and not in the legal sense. But people could wound one another in silence too, by absence, by hesitating to arrive, by withholding a truth not because it was dangerous, but because it had been too long. Just before noon, Janvier returned, wiping a fine drizzle from his shoulders. "Found it," he said. "Photo Éclair is a family-run shop in the 11th, Rue Saint-Bernard. Owner's name is Maxime Leconte. He's in today." Maigret was already reaching for his coat. The taxi ride took 15 minutes, the cab weaving through dense midday traffic, and the occasional shouting match between cyclists and delivery vans. Rue Saint-Bernard was narrow and lined with practical storefronts, a shoe repair shop, a charcuterie, and finally a faded awning that read Photo Éclair in gold lettering worn to bronze. Inside, the air smelled faintly of chemicals and old paper. The shop was small, filled with display cases of vintage cameras, curled film rolls, and thick photo albums for sale. Behind the counter stood a man of about 60, hair slicked back, a vest over his shirt. He looked up at Maigret with a tired politeness. "Bonjour, monsieur." "Chief Inspector Maigret," he said, showing his card. "I'm hoping you can help me identify a man who had film developed here some months ago." The shopkeeper's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with the quiet calculation of a man used to remembering faces. "I'll try. I don't deal with many these days. Everyone has their own machines now." Maigret passed him the receipt. 3 months ago, duplicates, black and white. The man studied it. Yes, I remember. He was an older gentleman, came in alone. Had a small envelope. Wanted 2 sets of a single photograph, insisted I develop them myself, not one of the boys. Did he say why? No, but he waited, sat right over there. He pointed to a battered wooden chair in the corner beside a heater that let off a faint ticking sound. Took his time, looked at the machines while I worked. When I gave him the prints, he asked for envelopes, addressed them by hand, carefully. I remember thinking it was as though he was performing something final. Do you know where he sent them? The man looked around the counter, then ducked beneath and came up with a ledger, handwritten entries in neat columns. I don't always record names, but I had to note the stamps. He bought them here. He flipped through the book and found the entry. He pointed. 2 envelopes, one to Lyon, one to Rue Portillon. Maigret breathed in slowly. Did you see the photograph? The man hesitated. Briefly. He dropped one by mistake. I picked it up. It was a portrait of a woman. Not young, studio photo. She had the look of someone who used to be elegant and was now simply tired. Maigret nodded. Thank you. Back on the street, the fog had lifted somewhat, revealing more of the city's pale mid-winter bones. The pavement shimmered, faintly, and the smell of roasting chestnuts floated in from a nearby vendor's cart. He walked now, not hurried, but with a direction newly formed. He was not following a trail so much as confirming a shape he already suspected, the outline of a decision made months ago, perhaps even years ago. Jules Varnet had sent 2 photographs, one to Madeleine, one to Nicole in Lyon perhaps, the niece he never spoke of but had kept in touch with. Why her? As a formality or as a signal? Either way, they were gestures of closure, not invitations. Maigret returned once more to the tobacco shop in the late afternoon. The light was changing, slanting through the windows now, warming the dust, motes that hung motionless in the air. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and stood without moving for several minutes. Then he walked upstairs, slowly, as if entering a space for the first time. The apartment smelled as it always had. Faint tobacco, old linen, the air of a room that had not been truly lived in for weeks. But there was something else now, a finality to the silence. On the nightstand, where before only the rosary and clock had rested, Maigret now noticed a folded paper beneath the edge of the lamp base. It had likely been overlooked before, not hidden, just misplaced. He picked it up. It was a note, written in the same careful hand as the one found earlier. The same blue ink. To whom it may concern, please do not search for me. Nothing has happened that was not decided long ago. I have made peace. There are no debts, no crimes, only a life that has reached its proper end. J.V. Maigret. Read it twice, then folded it again and placed it in his coat pocket. He stood for a while at the window. Across the street the florist had come out to sweep his step. A girl passed on a bicycle, singing to herself, scarf trailing behind like a banner in retreat. There was nothing more to investigate, no arrest to make, no mystery. if one insisted that mystery meant deceit. What remained was quieter than that. A man had lived his life beside the edges of what he once loved. He had watched, remembered, preserved. And then, without noise or fanfare, he had stepped out of it. Maigret returned to the Quai des Orfèvres as the sun dipped below the rooftops. He wrote no report. Instead, he poured himself a small glass of beer, lit his pipe, and sat watching the river for a long time. Not thinking, not solving. Just understanding. The train to Lyon left Gare de Lyon just after 7 in the morning, sliding out of Paris beneath a grey sky that seemed reluctant to let go. Maigret sat alone in a compartment, the window already misted with condensation. He didn't read the newspaper tucked under his arm, nor did he write in the small notebook he kept in his coat. He simply watched the landscape shift as the city fell away behind them. Factories, outer suburbs, then open fields where mist floated over damp furrows, and black crows stood still, like questions no one had asked yet. He had written a short note to Madame Maigret before leaving, letting her know he'd return the next evening. No details, just a location and a time. She wouldn't press. She never did when he left like this, drawn by something he couldn't quite explain but still needed to follow through. In Lyon, the wind had a different sharpness, less softened by riverbanks, and more likely to pass cleanly through a man's coat. The buildings held the same worn grace as Paris, but with a quieter dignity. Stone facades with chipped paint, narrow streets with names that had outlived the people who once whispered them. Nicole Varney's address was easy enough to find. A modest 3-story residence in the Croix-Rousse district, overlooking a communal garden, with rows of low stone benches and a few old trees bare of leaves. The building stood at a slope, its steps darkened by decades of rainfall and the careful feet of tenants who knew how to walk lightly. He rang the bell at the 2nd floor. A voice answered, cautious but not unfriendly. "Yes?" "Madame." "Varnet?" Maigret asked. "It's Chief Inspector Maigret from Paris." There was a pause, then the buzz of the door unlocking. The apartment smelled of orange peel, old books, and something faintly floral. Nicole Varnet was in her mid-30s, perhaps, with the kind of face that had been shaped more by experience than by luck. Her hair was pulled back simply, and she wore a sweater with small holes at the sleeve cuffs. She led him into a sitting room with a view of the garden, and gestured toward the armchair. "I was wondering if you'd come," she said. "You received the photograph?" She nodded. 3 weeks ago. No note. Just the picture. I hadn't seen her face since I was a child. He never spoke of her directly. Maigret studied her quietly. There was a steadiness in her, something that hadn't come easily. "You knew who she was?" "I guessed. When I was young, I once found an envelope in a drawer with a letter and a small black-and-white photo. The same one. My uncle had forgotten to lock it. I never asked him, but it stayed with me." She went to a low table and picked up the photograph. The same one Maigret had seen in the drawer, now propped up against a stack of mail. "Was she someone he lost?" she asked. "No," Maigret said, "someone he never had." She looked at him then, not surprised, just quietly resigned. "I think he was afraid of breaking things," she said, "even things he never touched. When I was little, I lived with him for 3 years. He wasn't warm, not in the usual way, but I never felt unsafe, just watched over from a distance. That sounds like him." "Why now?" she asked. "Why send the picture? Why disappear?" Maigret didn't answer right away. He rose and looked out the window at the garden below. A woman was feeding pigeons near one of the benches. Her coat was worn at the elbows. The birds fluttered softly around her shoes. "He said in a note that there were no crimes," Maigret said. "No deaths, just a life that had reached its proper end." Nicole said nothing for a long while. Then she asked, "Did he die?" I don't know, Maigret replied, but I believe he meant to. She folded her arms across her chest, not in anger, but against the cold. The radiator ticked behind. I wish he had told me, she said finally. Anything, even once. Maigret turned from the window. People like your uncle, they live beside things, not inside them. Love, grief, regret. They carry them like coat buttons, always there but rarely used. She gave a faint smile, though her eyes remained fixed on the floor. He never taught me to ride a bicycle, she said. But when I fell trying, he cleaned my scraped knee and left a bar of chocolate on the table the next morning. That sounds like him, too. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. Outside, the garden began to shift with life. School children passed on their way home. 2 elderly men sat on opposite benches without speaking, and a dog nosed through a pile of wind-blown leaves. Nicole stood and walked to a cupboard. She opened it and removed a thin packet, a letter still sealed. I found this in his things, mailed to me 5 days after the photograph arrived. I haven't opened it yet. Maigret hesitated. Would you like me to go? No, she said. Stay. She broke the seal and unfolded the letter. It was brief. Nicole, you are the only person I've ever written to without reservation. I have kept most of my life in quiet corners, and I'm not proud of that. But I wanted you to know. The photograph I sent is of someone I once loved and never harmed, but also never helped. I was always better at observing than participating. That was my failure. Thank you for never asking what I could not give. Be well. Jules Nicole didn't cry, but her breath caught slightly at the end. Maigret stood. He meant for you to have it. She nodded. He gave me more than he knew. He walked with her to the door, and they paused together before opening it. Outside, the hallway was quiet. If you ever come back to Lyon, she said, come for coffee. You'll like the garden in spring. I'm sure I would. She watched him go, and Maigret descended the stairs slowly, one hand grazing the rail. At the train station, he bought a sandwich and a newspaper. He wouldn't read. He boarded the train, sat by the window again and watched the grey begin to fade as they pulled out of Lyon. He didn't think about crime or justice or cases left unsolved. He thought about people, how they wait too long, how they choose. Silence, how sometimes they leave not to escape, but because the space between words has grown too wide to cross. The train moved steadily back toward Paris. Maigret lit his pipe and watched the smoke drift across the glass. There was nothing left to find, but in the quiet there was something understood. Rain greeted Maigret as he stepped off the train at Gare de Lyon. Not a storm, but a steady, insistent drizzle that washed over the platforms and made everything gleam faintly in the dimming light. He paused beneath the overhang, lit his pipe with a hand shielding the flame from the breeze, and let the smoke settle in his lungs like an old thought returning. It was late afternoon. The station bustled with arrivals and departures. Brief, reunions, porters pushing carts, announcements echoing from the high ceiling. Maigret moved through it all quietly, like a man coming back to a city he had never really left. By the time he reached Quai des Orfèvres, the rain had grown thinner, more mist than water. Inside the building, the familiar scent of old paper, pipe smoke and damp wool filled the air. Janvier looked up from his desk as Maigret entered. "You didn't take long," he said. "There wasn't much left to do," Maigret replied, hanging up his coat with practiced ease. He didn't sit. Immediately. Instead, he walked to the window at the far end of the office, the one overlooking the Seine. The river was a dull ribbon under the grey sky, broken only by a passing barge and the occasional reflection of lights flickering on in nearby buildings. Janvier stood and walked over. "You found her?" I did. And him? Maigret drew on his pipe, then exhaled slowly. Not exactly. But I found what he wanted us to see. Janvier didn't press further. He waited, knowing Maigret would speak when the words were ready. Maigret turned from the window. Have someone speak to the florist on Rue Montorgueil. Ask if he's seen Jules Varnet since last Thursday, quietly, and check the hospitals, the river morgue. You think he's... Maigret shook his head. I think he's elsewhere, but we should be thorough. Janvier nodded and returned to his desk. Maigret finally sat, the chair creaking slightly beneath him. He reached for a file folder but didn't open it. His eyes lingered on the corner of the desk where the photograph still rested, the one sent to Nicole, now returned by post. It had arrived during his trip to Lyon, in a plain envelope with no note enclosed. He had looked at it only once. There was something timeless in her expression, a kind of fading elegance mixed with resignation. The smile was hesitant, almost as if it didn't belong to her, but had been borrowed for the occasion. It was not unusual for photographs to outlast the relationships they once celebrated. Later that evening, after the others had gone, Maigret remained alone in the office. The lamp cast a soft circle of light over his papers, and the sound of distant traffic drifted up from the quay below. He opened his notebook and wrote a few lines. Not a formal report. No bureaucracy required this. Just a few notes for himself. Jules Varnet, tobacconist, age 73, no next of kin in Paris, known associate Madeleine Piquet, presumed alive. Last contact, photograph sent. No evidence of criminal activity. No final location confirmed. He paused, then added, a man who waited too long to say a thing, and then said it too late, but said it all the same. He closed the book and leaned back, the weight of the day settling over his shoulders. The building was nearly silent now, save for the faint hum of the radiators and the distant knock of a typewriter down the hall. He poured a small glass of brandy from the cupboard, kept not for celebration but for moments like this, and let it sit in his hand before sipping. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows over the cobblestones, their reflections shivering in the shallow puddles. He thought again of Nicole's apartment in Lyon, the stillness of it, the worn sweater she had worn, the way she had read her uncle's letter aloud with no need for tears. Some stories, Maigret knew, were not meant to end with closure. They were meant to end with a window left open, a garden in winter, and the sound of pigeons rustling among fallen leaves. And Mado, he wondered if she had received the photograph, if she had known what it meant, if she had kept it, or torn it in half and dropped it into the bin without looking back. There was no way to know, nor did he need to. That night, as he stepped outside into the soft dark and lit his pipe one last time, Maigret did not feel the need to pursue the case further. It had not ended, but it had resolved, quietly, without fanfare, in the way things sometimes do when all the noise has faded and only the truth remains. And that truth, as always, had not come from evidence. It had come from silence. A week passed. It was not remarkable in any outward way. Rain drifted in and out of the city like a guest unsure of its welcome. At Quai des Orfèvres, the rhythm of investigations continued. A burglary in the 7th, a domestic quarrel in the 11th, a strange letter delivered to a priest in Montmartre. The days unfolded one after the next, not with drama, but with the persistent, familiar hum of police work as it is in truth. Quiet, methodical, patient. Maigret took none of the new cases personally. He oversaw them, nodded at the right moments, gave brief instructions to Janvier, Lucas, Lapointe. He read reports, he smoked, he walked the corridors. But his thoughts often wandered, not to crime or guilt, but to Rue Montorgueil and the apartment above the tobacco shop, where an old man's routine had ended, not with tragedy, but with retreat. Then, on a damp Thursday morning, just as the sky had begun to brighten behind the fog, a small envelope was delivered. It arrived not by post, but slipped through the hand slot in the outer door. No return address, no stamp. The envelope was pale ivory, the kind sold at stationery counters long ago, not elegant but carefully chosen. Maigret noticed it immediately. Its weight not heavier than others, yet heavier in suggestion. His name was written on the front in a precise old-fashioned hand, Jules Maigret. He turned it over in his fingers before opening it, standing beside the radiator where his overcoat still hung drying. Inside was a single sheet of folded paper, its creases neat, its ink faint. The handwriting matched the earlier note from Varney, the same slanted rhythm, the restraint in every letter. Inspector Maigret, if this finds you, it is because I have gone where silence lives uninterrupted. You will have questions, and I have little to offer beyond this. I chose not to be found. I did not vanish. I removed myself, not in fear, not in despair. Simply an acknowledgement that some connections once loosened should not be tied again. I saw her once more. She did not see me. That was enough. You understood me better than I expected. Thank you for not chasing me with louder steps. Jules Varney. There was no date, no mention of location, but the note carried the strange, unmistakable sense of finality. Not like a man who feared he would be found, but like one who knew he would not be searched for any longer. Maigret folded the letter again and returned it to its envelope. He sat at his desk, lit his pipe and stared not at the paper but beyond it, as though the words had already evaporated and their meaning lingered only in the room's temperature. He didn't feel surprise, nor sorrow. What he felt was recognition. There had been once again no crime, and yet something had been lost. He took out the drawer that held the file labelled Varnet, Jules, Inquiry. It was thin, containing only a few handwritten notes, a copy of the receipt from photo. Eclair and the envelope Nicole had returned. No arrest sheet, no missing person declaration, no official report filed. He slipped the final letter into the folder, closed it, and returned it to the cabinet. At midday, Maigret stepped out for a walk. The sky was pale, the air sharp with ore. The smell of whetstone and something faintly metallic. The odour Paris always wore in spring's earliest moments, when the city was not yet thawed, but no longer frozen. He walked along the Seine, hands in his pockets, his hat angled low, pausing now and then to watch the barges slide past, their wake rippling out in symmetrical patterns behind them. Eventually, he found himself once again on Rue Montorgueil. He hadn't intended to go there, but his steps had led him without resistance. The tobacco shop's shutters remained drawn. A faint handbill had been pasted beside the frame, announcing a rent auction next month. Dust clung to the inside of the glass now, and in the slot of the door, a flyer for discount cigarettes remained untouched. Maigret crossed the street. The florist standing in the open doorway of his shop noticed him and gave a polite nod. "Still nothing?" Maigret asked. "No one's seen him. His name came up once. He's an older customer asked for a specific pipe tobacco. Said Varnet always stocked it. I told him he was gone." The florist tilted his head slightly. "You—" "No, Inspector. Sometimes I wonder if people disappear because they're tired of being the person others remember them as." Maigret smiled faintly. "Or because they're afraid they won't be remembered at all." The florist nodded. "Same thing, perhaps." Maigret thanked him and continued down the street, his feet slow but certain. That evening at home, Madame Maigret prepared a simple veal stew. They ate in silence for the first few minutes, as they often did, the clink of forks and the occasional creak of the chair the only sounds. Then, without turning from her plate, she said, "Did you find what you were looking for?" Maigret didn't answer right away. "I found someone who no longer wanted to be found," he said at last, "and someone else who had waited too, long for the past to arrive again." She nodded. "That happens." They finished their meal. Later, as she washed the dishes and he dried them, she asked no more questions. When the evening settled into quiet, and the radio murmured a slow jazz melody across the parlor, Maigret returned to his armchair and took up his pipe again. He didn't read. He didn't smoke. He simply sat, listening to the silence as it fell around him, warm and constant. Some mysteries resolved themselves with revelation, others resolved themselves with distance, and a few, the most human ones, resolved themselves with acceptance, with the knowledge that not every connection needed an answer, and not every vanishing was a disappearance. Sometimes it was simply a man closing the door behind him without saying goodbye. And that was enough.